European Union has expanded throughout its history, beginning with only 6 founding states, compared to today's total of 27 member states. And there are still many countries outside the EU who would want to become a part of it. But how do you actually join the EU? What criteria and requirements does a new country have to fulfill? And how does the EU decide if it wants to accept or deny a new country's entry into the Union? That is the topic of this video. And we begin by looking at Article 49 in the Treaty on the European Union. The Treaty on the European Union, that is kind of like the EU's constitution. And Article 49 is about how EU expansion works. And so it begins by saying any European state, which means that only European states can join the Union, which makes sense because it's the European Union. But it is actually quite unclear what European means because it's not defined. So it's up to the European Council to decide if a country is European or not, and so if they are eligible to join or not. And for example, in the 1980s, Morocco wanted to join the European Union, but the Council denied their application with the reasoning that Morocco isn't European. And another example is when Cyprus wanted to join, and they are geographically not European, they are a part of Asia, but the European Council argued that they are culturally European, and so they approved their application, and Cyprus eventually did become a part of the European Union. So that's the first condition, to be a European state. And then it continues and says that any European state which respects the values referred to in Article 2. And now you might wonder, well, what does it say in Article 2? And I have Article 2 right here. It says, well, I don't have to read all of it. You can pause and read yourself if you want to, but it basically says that you need to respect, human rights, democracy, freedom, rule of law. You need to be a democratic, law-abiding country with certain rights and freedoms for your citizens. So that's the basic conditions. You need to be a European state, and you need to respect the values of the EU. And then the article goes into how the application process works. So it says that the applicant state shall address its application to the Council, which shall act unanimously after consulting the Commission and after receiving the consent of the European Parliament. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that it needs to address its application to the Council. And the Council in this case is the Council of Ministers. So a council with a minister from every member state of the EU. And they need to act unanimously. So every single state that's a part of the EU need to agree on letting in a new member. And it also says that they need to consult the Commission. And the Commission actually has a very important role, even though it just says that they need to consult the Commission. The Commission actually does a lot of the work before a country joins. So the Commission makes sure that the country can implement all the EU's laws and that they are fulfilling all the obligations. So if the Commission doesn't think that you are ready, then you're probably not getting into the Union. And then it also says that you need to receive the consent of the European Parliament. And that just means that the Parliament has a veto in this matter. So if the Parliament doesn't want you in the Union, they can block you. And the Parliament is, the directly elected representatives of the European people. So it's important that they have a say in this as well. So now we've talked about these three institutions, the Commission, the Parliament, and the Council of the EU. But then we also need to take into consideration the European Council, because it says that the conditions of eligibility agreed upon by the European Council shall be taken into account. And now it's really important to understand the difference between the European Council and the Council of the EU, because they are different institutions. The Council of the EU is made up of ministers from every member state, while the European Council is made up of heads of state or heads of government of every member state. So the European Council is, you could say that they are on a higher level because it's heads of states or heads of government that discusses topics, more high-level, long-term topics in the European Council. And so it's up to the European Council to agree on conditions that need to be met before a country can join the EU. So apart from that they need to be a European state and that they need to respect the values in Article 2, a new country also have to meet the conditions that the European Council has agreed upon. And the current conditions are the Copenhagen criteria that the Council agreed upon in 1993. And one final thing I'm just going to say is that even though, as we can see here, officially the decision is up to the Council of the EU to unanimously, vote if a country is supposed to get in or not, it's often, in practice, the European Council who decides. Firstly, because there are more high-level politicians in the European Council, and secondly, because the European Council and the Council of the EU both represent the member states. They come from the same government. So if your prime minister tells you to do something, then of course you're going to do what he tells you. So if your prime minister, who has agreed on something in the European Council, tells you, the minister in the Council of the EU, to vote yes, then of course you're going to vote yes. So in practice, it's up to the European Council to decide on expansion and when and how and if a country gets into the Union. And if we are to summarize what we just went through about enlargement, enlargement is what you call expansion of the EU when new countries join. You must be a European state. You must respect the values in Article 2, so you need to be democratic, have freedom, rule of law, etc. You need to meet the Copenhagen criteria, which I will soon explain. And you need to get approved by Council, Commission, and Parliament, so the institutions of the EU who represents the interests of the EU itself, the member states, and the people of the EU. Okay, so what are the Copenhagen criteria? They are criteria divided into 3 different categories: political, economical, and legislative. So the political criteria is that you have stable institutions that can guarantee democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and protection of minorities. So basically, you are a stable democracy. Then you have the economic criteria, which is that you have a functioning market economy and the ability to cope with competitive pressure and market forces within the EU. So you have to have a functioning economy, a market economy, and you have to be able to actually cope with being a part of the EU's internal market. Then we have the legislative criteria, and that means that you have to bring all your laws in line with EU law, and you also have to prove that you have the capacity to implement them and future laws. So what that means is that you can't just officially sign all these laws into reality, but then not implement them in practice. You have to prove that you have actually implemented them and that you are enforcing them, and that you have the ability to implement and enforce future laws that the EU passes. And here we also have something called, I don't know exactly how to pronounce it, but the acquis, which means that you have to implement all the accumulated laws that, for a current member of the EU, it's fairly easy to implement EU law because you only have to implement a new law once it's passed. But for a new member, you have to implement all the accumulated laws that the EU has ever made, that they have ever made that they are still active. And so there's quite a lot of work to be done. And all this accumulated law has been divided into different chapters that you need to complete before joining the union. So I just want to show you quickly here on the website of the European Commission all the chapters. So there are a total of 35 chapters, as you can see. And for example, we have Chapter 4, Free Movement of Capital. And that begins with member states must remove, with some exceptions, all restriction on movement of capital, both within the EU and between member states. And then it continues. So to close this chapter, to complete this chapter, the applicant country who wants to become a part of the EU, they have to reach all of these goals. They have to implement all the EU laws to make sure that there are free movement of capital. And now I'll get into kind of how the negotiation looks when a new country wants to complete all these chapters. And so how it works is that the Commission, the European Commission, compares the laws of the EU and of the applicant country and identifies what needs to be changed. And if a country reaches sort of a minimum requirement for a certain chapter, the Council can vote to begin negotiating that chapter, so they unanimously vote. And negotiation, that just means that the applicant country works on implementing the EU law until the EU is satisfied. So the applicant country may say, look what I've done, now I'm ready to join, I've finished this chapter. But the EU may say, no, you still have some work left to do, you need to improve this, and so there's a negotiation until the EU is satisfied. And then the Council unanimously has to vote to close the chapter. So they both vote to begin negotiating a chapter and vote to close a chapter. Because there are 35 different chapters, they have to vote like 70 times unanimously until a country has finished all the chapters. So there's very, very many times where a country could put in their veto if they are unsatisfied with the process. And then, when all 35 chapters are closed, the applicant can join the EU if all other conditions are met as well. Okay then, so to finish, I'm just going to go over what the different institutions involved do, what their role is, kind of a summary of what we've been going through. So we have the Council of Ministers. They receive the application and make the decision. We have the Commission. They do screening and reports, and they give recommendations but can't veto. But they can't veto, but they play a really, really important role because they are the ones that makes sure that a country actually implements the laws correctly and all that. So they can't veto, but in practice, if the Commission doesn't think you're ready, then you're probably not going to join yet. Then we have the Parliament, as I said, they have a veto. Then we have the Council, the different council, the Council of Heads of States and Government. They are the ones who set the overall political directions, when the negotiations can actually begin. They don't actually have the official role of deciding, because that's the Council of Ministers' role. But in practice, they do make the decisions. And this is because, as I've said earlier, that both the Council of Ministers and the councils and then the Council of Heads of States and Government, they represent the same government, they represent the member states. So they are, almost always in line with each other. They always agree. And so in practice, the Council of Heads of States, announce the big decisions. But officially, it's the Council of Ministers who actually takes the decisions. Yeah, so that's how you can join the EU. And as we can see on this map, there are quite a lot of countries who are candidates, so they are in the process of joining the EU, even though many candidate countries are only candidates on paper. Like Turkey, they've been a candidate for decades, but they haven't gotten closer to joining. But then we do have countries like Ukraine who really, really wants to join, but it's probably going to be a long journey before that actually happens. And then we have some countries in the Balkan. We have countries like Georgia, who was on a pretty good path to joining, but then there was a regime change, and now they are probably not joining anytime soon. But now you know what the actual requirements are and how this process looks like. So now if you watch the news about a country potentially joining the EU, you know how it actually works. Yeah, but that was all. So thank you for watching, and if there are any corrections you want to make about things I got wrong, then please comment, or if you have any questions.